Could a masked vigilante exist in today's society, fighting crime and injustice? And by trying to achieve superhero status ourselves, what can we learn to become better humans?
How come nobody's ever tried to be a superhero?
There are small groups of guys that are out there doing stuff.
They're taking basically the law into their own hands, right? That's not legal.
Whether or not there's somebody in this real world that could be like Batman and exist, I absolutely believe that it could happen.
What are you? I'm Batman.
This is the Vigilante Superstar Podcast.
Hey, Terry. Welcome to the Vigilante Superstar Podcast. Maiden Voyage, Episode 1. Welcome on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So why don't you give us a quick nickel tour of your career and kind of what brings you to me, I guess, in this conversation?
Absolutely. So I'm an academic. I've been teaching in higher ed for over 20 years, maybe over 25 now. And in that time, I've always sort of walked this line between literary studies and media studies. And the place that I particularly landed was the study of comic books and graphic novels. It brought together my love of the word and the image in this interesting way. And when I first embarked upon this journey, it was at a time when people were still sort of questioning whether or not this was a valid thing to be studying at all. Right. But in the past 20, 25 years, it's become not only recognized as this major multimedia conglomerate that can make serious money, but on top of that, it's also something that people have started to identify as mythic and artistic. So that's been an interesting part of my journey. Mm-hmm. I'm a writer. I've written 3 books on my own and edited 3 other books. I've been focusing primarily on genres in comic books. So I started off by focusing on the superhero story, moved on to crime comics, then horror comics, currently working on a science fiction book right now. So science fiction comics is what I'm looking at. The other things that I've edited, I focused on different aspects of the superhero. I'm particularly interested in the way that we tend to revise superheroes. Because we come back to those stories and we revisit them over and over again. And then certain authors. My most recent collection has been a collection of interviews with Robert Kirkman, most famous for The Walking Dead.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Awesome. So the premise, obviously, of the podcast is, similar to a movie that I'm working on currently right now, which you were involved in as kind of a guide through it, honestly. And so that'll be coming out hopefully this year. But the premise is really, looking at a vigilante hero like a Batman, who's obviously the most iconic and the most famous of all, who doesn't have these godlike powers. In looking at, ever since I saw the 1989 Batman, this is what I always refer back to with Michael Keaton. I was just like a high school kid. I remember seeing that movie, and I'd only seen comics. I used to love comic books when I was a kid. And I saw that 1989 version of Batman, and I thought, wow, that's cool. They give him like body armor and like a bulletproof car. And I thought, and I've been truly, no joke, fascinated with this concept since then. I thought about writing a book about it, but I'm not really a writer. And as I got more into media, I thought, okay, let's explore that. And that's kind of what my movie is going to explore. Could someone like this exist? And taking a deep dive. But the second part is, what can that teach us about becoming better people, I guess, and striving for that kind of high level, whether it's intelligence, learning, compassion, whether it's just fitness, training, nutrition, what can that teach us about being a better person? So that brings me to you as kind of our first episode, Maiden Voyage, kind of the guide through this, because you have all of the answers when it comes to, a character like Batman and kind of where that originates from. So we're going to kind of dive into this conversation about, kind of that history, but also, the origin story, which is always fascinating with comic heroes, as well as to kind of end up like, do we think that this is possible, and what can we learn to become better people through this? So I guess the first question is, let's talk about, what does it look like in literature to be a larger than life hero? Obviously, we don't have boring heroes in literature. We have glamorous, exciting heroes. What does that look like?
Well, it depends. I mean, I think that there's actually some boring protagonists in literature, but that is not usually what we're talking about when we say larger than life. I think a contemporary synonym with larger than life is epic. But epic, of course, is derived from a very particular literary tradition, the epic story, something we see coming out of oral culture. And it usually involves larger than life heroes. What we would refer to now probably as myths, or what the study of mythology. In the Western tradition, we derive from Greco-Roman mythology, Norse mythology, Anglo-Saxon mythology, and they usually revolve around these characters that in some way establish values for civilization. So I think that gets to something that you are hinting at, that the heroes are usually there to teach us how to be better than we were before. So classic examples would be something like the Aeneid in the Roman tradition, because Aeneas is someone who actually founds Rome. So literally is the builder of that civilization. But even before Aeneas, and the model for the Aeneid would be the Iliad and the Odyssey. With the Odyssey, we have Odysseus. And Odysseus is an ordinary man, sort of, but he kind of has a special relationship with the gods. So that's one of the things when it comes to these larger than life heroes, they always seem to transcend the normal boundaries of humanity. So we start off with someone who is pretty smart. That's Odysseus. That's his number one characteristic. He's a fascinating hero because he moves beyond the muscular warrior hero. He's the guy who outthinks the situation, and he builds the Trojan horse, and he wins the Trojan War that way. But he's most famous for this journey home, where he's kicked about by the gods because he has too much pride. And so that's part of it too. He represents the old values of great Greek civilization, but there are times when he himself, by his own talents, is pushed beyond that, so that he becomes full of pride and often gets people like beside him kind of ticked at him. That's bad if you are ticking off the god of the sea and you're traveling home that way.
How has that kind of, I guess, progressed? I mean, we don't have a ton of time, right? But how has that progressed into kind of the modern day? I don't think I'm jumping the gun here, but modern day, a Batman type character, a Daredevil type character, a Spider-Man type character, those are also larger than life characters. I specifically point to Batman because he's just, by all intents and purposes, a normal guy who just has incredible skills and intelligence. So how does that translate, I guess, from historical to now? I mean, Batman's historical too, but kind of to where we land now. Right.
Well, the heroes always establish this certain pattern that they conform to. And I think that is very much part of what we see in the superhero story. So just to give you an example, when we're looking at mythology and these larger than life heroes, we're often looking at heroes who engage in a certain type of journey. So I'm going to refer to a classic mythicist, someone who studied mythology cross-culturally. Joseph Campbell looked at myths that existed cross-culturally in the Western tradition. And he said that these are the basic steps that we can expect in the journey. He referred to it as the hero monomyth, which, by the way, was a circular journey, not a linear journey. So the monomyth indicated that for the most part, heroes had a low birth, they had a period of achievement, they faced death and sometimes literally died, and then were reborn. Now, the reason that I think that this is so important is because when it comes to the modern superhero, we can recognize a lot of these characteristics. We can recognize a lot of these things showing up over and again. Now, to fill in the gaps between, say, ancient Greek mythology and contemporary comic book superheroes, I will say that this is a resurgence in a certain kind of storytelling. You said that there are no boring heroes. Well, sometimes there are pretty dull protagonists. As we moved from an oral culture where people created these ideas of heroes that were grounded in physical achievement, we moved into the novel with a written culture, and we tended to focus a little bit more on psychology. Hamlet is a great example of how we transitioned over into the thinking man's hero, but we seem to have swung back with certain genres. the Western, the science fiction story, and the superhero story. We've come back to that because it seems like we have this desire to see something larger than life. Now, the cultural reasons for that probably are very, very complex.
Well, that's what I was going to, if I interrupt 1 second, what I was going to ask you specifically about that was, I guess, and maybe this is a cultural question, maybe you're not a sociologist, but is that sociologist? Yeah. But why? Like, why are we so, maybe this is just a broader question. Like, why do we need this stuff in literature? Why do we have to have these, again, larger than life heroes that we just idolize for decade upon decade, century upon century? I mean, why do we as humans desire that so much?
Well, and the question is, why do we need it now, right? There seems to be different kinds of heroes over time. Like, say, during that literary period, we had someone like Robinson Crusoe, who was the great survivor, but not the same kind of thing as Batman or Daredevil, who fights against an opponent and seems to fight for certain principles. And in terms of what we have nowadays, we have I'm gonna do the academic thing and refer to another author again. We've had a couple different people like Peter Coogan and Richard Reynolds who've extended the monomyth that Joseph Campbell came up with and identified other characteristics that seem to be very notable around the superhero. So Richard Reynolds is one of my favorites. He identifies lots of characteristics, but I think the most salient ones are the traumatic origin, the dual identity, and the orphan status. These are things that superheroes all have. And if you pause for a minute and you start listing off your superheroes, you go Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, right? And you're like, oh yeah, they do all fulfill those characteristics. Why? I really believe that the superhero is a uniquely American invention, something that sort of melds the wildness of the Old West with the principles of the Enlightenment period. And you think about who we are as Americans, and it totally fits. Yeah. So if we're talking about the traumatic origin, we're referring to, the early years when we fought a revolution and a civil war. We think about the ways in which we have this dual identity sort of pushing back and forth between the gunslinger and the diplomat. And then the orphan status, we seem to be by ourselves, at least for a long time, when it comes to democracy in the free world. So I think that this is something that is indicative of cultural change. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that, well, let me ask this. What do you think not the comics, but also other works of literature teaches? I mean, we talked about Joseph Campbell, and I even talk about that in my media classes as well. We're talking about it tomorrow, actually. And maybe I'll play this podcast, but what is that, I guess, the way it's written, not only from a mythological standpoint, but even modern hero, literature. What does that teach us about the origins of heroes typically? I know you kind of hit on it a little bit, but maybe go into a little more detail on that. Well, I think that one of the things that we can say is that there is this common thread as we look throughout history. If we go back to Joseph Campbell would say we're hardwired to seek out heroes like this. He was very much an advocate for the theories of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and the collective unconscious, that we're all tied together in this way. I think it indicates that there is something that makes culture for us. The journey of the hero is something that many people have said resembles the typical things that we go through in our life, the rites of passage that we go through. So it doesn't matter whether you are a young man in a American Indian tribe going out on the first hunt, or an exchange student going off to college. There's always this sense that you move away from what's known, you master a new skill, and you come back a changed person. Which is why that circular journey is so important, because it's not just one part of your life. It's not one and done. You're not finished. You continue to go through this over and over again, which is why I think people go back to the stories of superheroes, because we tend to repeat these stories with variations, right? With Superman, we keep coming back to the same sort of civilization saving narrative. We go back to Spider-Man, and we keep seeing him deal with with this guilt over and over again and try to push past the trauma for what he considers to be the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah, I think like you said, I mean, we all go on the journey, right? Everyone's on the journey. I'm making a movie. That was a journey. It was an insane journey, right? And so I think there's obviously the comparison, like we can relate to these characters, but they're always like bigger and the stakes are higher. Maybe their intelligence is higher, their skills are higher. Everything makes it more like amped up and exciting, which makes sense, I guess. I mean, to hold interest, especially now we just did Superman a few years ago and now we're redoing Superman again, but in a completely different style from a different director. We've done way more than 3 versions of Batman in the last 20 to 30 years. And we keep coming back to it is the same thing, like you said, over and over again, but we still consume it. We still love it. We love it. And we like to see the little... Yeah.
The joke about superheroes, like we could pick anyone, right? We could pick Superman, we could pick Batman. And the enduring joke is, when we make another movie, how often are we going to see the superhero's origin? And the answer is every time.
Yeah.
Every time. Because that is the essence of what we want to see. We want to see that struggle that is the kernel of who they are.
Well, yeah. And you want to have, I think, too, that emotes, right? I mean, if it's just someone that's like Superman with godlike powers and he's just this normal dude who just goes out and can bash anyone over the head and stop a train and jump over a building, cool. But like knowing that he comes from tragedy, right, makes it a more emotive experience. And that's why I always really like Daredevil. Daredevil was my favorite comic book growing up, especially the Frank Miller stuff in there.
Absolutely.
Some of the best. I just bought that graphic novel last year. It's just taking like the emotiveness, if that's even a word, of that journey that Matt Murdock goes through. And he comes from tragedy. His dad was a boxer who was involved with the mob, and he doesn't really have parents raising him. Then he gets these powers, but he's still kind of a normal guy. He can just hear and kind of use sonar, but he's really just a guy that trained much like Batman. And I love the underdog story. And I know we talked about that before too, just the underdog story. I never was a big Superman fan because to me, it felt like, I would look at some of the comics and think, well, he's just so incredibly powerful. So unless you create a character that's his equal, what's at stake? And they did a good job. I think Zack Snyder did a pretty good job with Man of Steel of making him a little bit human and what he went through growing up as kind of a different type of kid. I personally like that. I like that movie a lot.
I'm with you. I mean, I think that when you look at superheroes, Superman is incredibly hard to write well. Yeah. I think every once in a while people do write him well. And I think always Zack Snyder makes some of the most interesting 2/3 of a movie.
That's exactly right.
Just like the first 2/3 is excellent. And then when we get to that third act, he always has trouble.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the idea of Superman as the outsider in Man of Steel, that scene where he retreats to a closet in his school and has this sort of autistic response to his powers.
Yep.
It's brilliant, and it shows that there is this struggle. Or even, the much maligned Batman versus Superman. I mean, the things that were going on there. So I'll just focus on what's going on with Superman there. I love the conflict between him and Perry White.
Yeah.
He was, as Clark Kent, he was trying to be the idealistic reporter, right? He was trying to report on what was happening in Gotham City. And Perry White was like, no, go ahead and cover the football game. That's what everyone wants.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I was a huge fan of Daredevil as well. I grew up with Frank Miller's Daredevil. And one of the things that, he is one of the most, embattled heroes, in terms of his tragic origin, because his superpowers, and this is sometimes the case, that there's an accident, but it also is tied to his loss, right?
Yeah.
He loses his ability to see. So there's loss that's built into that. And then he is constantly, that blindness with Frank Miller is a sort of metaphor, because there are all those things that he's blind to. He just can't see. He can't see how bad Elektra is, right? He wants her to be good, but she really is not. He may love her, but sorry, but that woman is not good for you. And that's the thing, is that very often in these superhero stories, we see them teetering over and over again.
Yeah.
And I mentioned Spider-Man. Spider-Man is always hanging just over this abyss of guilt for everything he's done. It comes back over and over again. He makes these decisions that are bad decisions, and he has to deal with it. So, for a long time, it's Uncle Ben, and then it's Gwen Stacy, and then we keep piling it on after that, because it's these things that they have to overcome in order to be a force of good.
Yeah. I always make the joke with my kids. I'm like, I'm the giving tree, right? Shel Silverstein. Like when I feel like I've been just doing a ton and sacrificing a ton, I'm like, you know what, guys, I'm kind of the giving tree, and you're left with just a stump. Right. And I feel like that's what I like about a good hero in a story is I always felt like, and I'll use the word that I used when I was little, battle damage. I thought it was so Daredevil would get the crap kicked out of him all the time. It was like, he didn't come out unscathed. He always was beat up. Even Batman would escape a lot of that sometimes, because of his wit or his gadgets or whatever. Daredevil is just a street level brawler with a couple sticks in his pocket that could hear really well and maneuver and do parkour across buildings. But man, he would just take a pounding. And on top of that, you're dealing with the loss, and he's trying to overcome Hell's Kitchen and Kingpin, and who he can never defeat. And it's just this ongoing battle. I always love that. So do we need I know in Joseph Campbell, maybe some type of origin story is obviously huge, but like tragic origin. So you'd mentioned that before. Does the tragic origin, is it necessary? And this could even relate to a real life scenario. Do you think tragedy, obviously in our heroes, is we write that into our heroes. Obviously, as the case with the superheroes, so many have tragic origin stories, which I guess, do you need that tragic story to get to this higher level? And if that makes sense, like, are we seeing that in our heroes, obviously? And then does that translate even to real life in your opinion? Like, when we have these people that are larger than life in real life, I mean, does the origin story of tragedy help lead to a greater, I guess, ceiling of what they can achieve in their lives, if that makes sense?
Well, the traumatic origin certainly makes for good drama. Yeah. It's something that we start with because we want to see our heroes overcome something like that. But it's also a little bit problematic because we romanticize suffering. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that suffering, or at least firsthand suffering, is always essential for the development of a hero. Now, I love the drama and the compounding of that trauma, just following that and trying to unravel that. So one of my favorites along those lines is The Flash. And the recent movie tried to work with some of his stuff, and did a fine job, but not that great.
The cartoon was actually better. I just watched the Flashpoint cartoon, and I was like, oh, this is the actual story. This is actually pretty good. So that's what they tried to do.
Right. So the huge thing with The Flash is that, really he finds out that over the course of his life, all these things that he's been suffering through, the death of his mother and the imprisonment of his father, is orchestrated by one of his greatest villains from the future, who has the same powers as him and the ability to travel through time. So I love that story, but at the same time, I hesitate to say that that's what a hero needs, that he has to compound that tragedy. Another good example of the hero who has endless numbers of tragedies is someone like Wolverine. Right. And in fact, one of my favorite explanations of what goes on with Wolverine, with the origin you can never really know, is that he has a healing power, and that healing power masks all of the terrible things that has happened to him, because so many bad things that happen. And yet, despite this, animal-like rage that he has, he still is the guy who somehow comes out the other end wanting to believe in something what Charles Xavier comes up with. Now, can we do it without that? I'm going to go to stories again, and we have had some exploration of that. We have a story by Alan Moore about Superman, which is for the man who has everything, and it's this one in which this villain stops Superman with this intergalactic plant. Basically, he throws it on his chest, and he moves into this trance-like state where Krypton is never destroyed.
Okay.
And he ends up on Krypton, and he lives most of his life. But when he lives most of his life, he finds that it, in fact, is something so far from who he is now. But the interesting thing is that when he comes out of it and fights against our, muscle-bound supervillain, he's angry. Because that's part of what Superman always wanted. He wanted to be ordinary, and he realizes that if he were ordinary and not someone who lost his homeworld, he wouldn't be Superman.
Mm-hmm.
So Alan Moore's case in that story is, yeah, we actually do need the trauma. There's a Batman anniversary story that takes a different tack. It starts off with the Phantom Stranger, so this mystical DC superhero, showing up and saying, you know what? There's these parallel worlds. We can save a Bruce Wayne from ever having to lose his parents.
Mm-hmm.
So Batman and Robin go to this parallel world. They save Bruce Wayne's parents. They save the Waynes, and he grows up with parents. And the interesting thing is that in this story, he still becomes Batman. In this world, there's no obvious role models for him in terms of what he might be as a superhero, but he still perceives these needs in the world. Which is the other part that I would really try to emphasize, is that I think sometimes we can identify the needs that are out there, even though we might not have experienced those needs. So we might not have grown up in abject poverty, but we look outside ourselves and we say, but that's a problem and it needs to be addressed. Or we might not have been the victim of crime, but we see other people who have.
Right.
And we say that needs to be rectified.
Yeah. And a lot of the people that I interviewed for the film, I would always ask them, just because I thought I might use it at one point, like, hey, because some of these guys were great athletes or soldiers or special forces. And I would say, hey, obviously to get through BUDS training, Navy SEAL training is one of the hardest trainings in the world. And one of the guys I asked was like, he had a horribly tragic childhood where people that were close to him passed away. He almost committed murder. He was going to do a life of crime, but chose to just go join the Navy, and it changed his life completely. And then the next guy I talked to, who was a SEAL sniper for SEAL Team 4, literally was like, yeah, I was going to be an architect, but I was like, oh, the Navy sounds cool. So, I mean, it's just, and they both got through it, and they both had long careers in the Navy and were, successful special forces operators. And it's just, yeah, I think we like to glamorize that. I mean, and there are a ton of stories out there, obviously, of tragic stories in all the interviews that I did. But there's also some where it's like, well, they just have some drive that we don't necessarily, not everyone has. I have drive to finish a film. I have drive for the passions that I'm interested in, as do you. But, the origin, I think, is just, like you said, something that's fascinating with heroes. It just makes it more exciting, I guess. So that kind of brings me to, let's take a look specifically at Batman, because that's the closest parallel, I guess, to what the movie that I'm creating is about, and also sort of the conversation of where the podcast is going to go. So, we know that Batman has a tragic origin story, and that's been reinvented a million times. Because I think you told me, just real quick, I think you'd mentioned that Batman didn't always have a dark beginning, right? You want to just, that might be interesting for people too, because everybody thinks of him as like his parents in the alley getting killed, gunned down by this horrible person. What was it initially?
Initially, he didn't have a story. That's the thing, is that he was just a rich guy. And I think if we go back a little bit, we see the birth of superheroes alongside the advent of Pulp Fiction. So both of these forms of literature that seem to appeal to blue collar readers. They were very much oriented towards heroes and what they could do. So one of the famous heroes in Pulp Fiction was Zorro,
right?
Who also was an aristocrat who put on a mask. But the reason he did it was that he recognized that there were these injustices that he couldn't control as a rich man. It seems like at the very beginning in Detective Comics, that was what we had with Batman. Was it he just knew he had to be Batman. And then once he got his own series, once we went into Batman #1, we had this very quick reference to his origin. Yes, his parents were killed.
At what point,
by criminals?
Sorry to interrupt. When did that happen? Like culturally, when did that happen? Did it happen in the 50s, the 60s? Like when did that?
Oh no, it did happen pretty early, but it was about a year later, after we had enjoyed all of these Batman stories. Suddenly we felt like we needed a backstory. up to that point, it was primarily focused. It was, what we had was a series of adventures, much like we would have with Odysseus, right?
Right.
As he's bouncing from one place to another. That's sort of what we had with Batman. And the starting point was inconsequential,
Yeah.
which we do often find in epic stories. And then we circle back,
Yeah.
right? Well, then we do find this out. And it wasn't, I would say, as far as the deep development of something like this, that was the 1950s. That
Okay.
was where we
Okay.
went back and we really dug into it, and we started to work with the psychology of it. There's this long famous story about Batman and his relationship with his father. Later on, there's this reinvention of his father as a crime fighter.
Okay.
So actually a
Right.
source of inspiration. But we built it up over the course of time. And now, of course, if we do a movie series, we have something like Batman Begins, which is almost entirely about the beginning of the story.
Which I love. I think I almost like that. This is probably sacrilegious to say this, but I think I almost like Batman Begins more than The Dark Knight. I love the way they did it. It was really well done. And I feel like The Dark Knight's amazing. I mean, you can't argue it's one of the greater comic book movies of all time, but for some reason, I love the way they did that origin. Which, again, it's just another way that it's been told. I mean, the Keaton version, the different versions have done it a little differently, but they always go back to it. Even in the Zack Snyder version, we have quick flashbacks to show the brooding Bruce Wayne, right? We need to see where that came from. Even in the new Batman movie, there's some of that, that's obviously alluded to, and that his dad maybe was a criminal, and there's more stuff coming out with that too. Okay, so a couple things here too, so we're not just rambling on this forever, but I know you probably would talk about this for 14 hours straight.
I would.
I know you would.
I would just ramble on this forever.
You're way too smart, honestly. But what else does, and we'll use Batman or some type of vigilante hero. What other things does the hero need to succeed? Obviously, Joseph Campbell can tell us some things about the mystical object and the mentor and things like that. What does the hero need to succeed? And I think, again, this is all translatable to real life. I mean, if you play football, you have a coach, you might have a trainer. If you're a soldier, you have your team, you have your intel person. What did Batman need ultimately? And I know it was reinvented a million times, but what did Batman need to succeed?
Well, along those lines, I mean, I think you hit it on the head, with the reference back to Campbell, because if we're thinking about the journey of the hero, which is a circular journey, if we're on this side of the journey, the beginning of the journey, we've got the mentor over here, but then as we move over here, we've got the allies which come in, because somewhere along the lines you lose your mentor.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the mentor is someone who is stereotypically older and experienced, and is not going to be around forever.
Right.
So at a certain point, the hero becomes the leader or the mentor to others. Mm-hmm. But both of these are necessary. And, we often work almost exclusively in film with Batman as a lone figure. Mm-hmm. Because we just don't move that far, right? We only get 3 movies out of this trilogy before it goes south. But if we look at the comics, there's always the Bat family. Okay, so there's always Robin, and then there's Batgirl, and then there's others that usually are in that same sort of constellation. Similar to the same way that there's Superman, and I'm not just talking about the Justice League. There's other permutations on Superman. There's all of these followers that need to be a part of it. With Batman in particular, he needs a network of support. Mm-hmm. So before he makes that complete transition, we have the key figure of Commissioner Gordon, mm-hmm. because on one hand he's a vigilante, and this is the back and forth with Batman. Is he propelled by revenge or justice? And we never really answer that completely, but he always has his one foot in that justice category, and I think that characters like Commissioner Gordon are what keep him grounded. Mm-hmm. So he needs Alfred, he needs Commissioner Gordon, and then he also needs a sense of responsibility to someone like his ward, right? Dick Grayson as Robin, because he starts to assume that parental role. There's been lots of interesting permutations again with Batman and experimentation, like you said, just pushing him in one direction or another. There's been some variations on it, which has suggested he would be a really bad parent, but others that identify that he's the perfect parent for someone like Dick Grayson, who has gone through the same sort of traumatic experience that he has. So what does a hero need? Definitely needs someone to guide them, someone to keep them grounded, and someone to feel like they are responsible for. So there's that community that exists around the superhero, and that is again very classically heroic. It's always understood in relationship to the community. Who are you in relationship to your community?
Yeah, and it's like you said, I think moral compass. I mean, if you were doing this for real, I mean, so many situations would come about where it would get gray in terms of what is right and what is wrong, and okay, I'll ask you this too, because this is interesting, always an interesting question. Should Batman kill? That's been explored in various versions. You have the Nolan version where he really doesn't want to kill. He'll maim people to the point of death, but he won't necessarily kill. And then Snyder's version, that guy would probably do, like, even that warehouse scene, he probably killed some people. I mean, where do we see that? And generally speaking, in the comics, like, Batman is not a killer, correct?
No, he isn't. And one of the things that I would refer back to, as far as the question of where he is in that gray space, would be something like The Dark Knight Returns.
Mm-hmm.
So the classic Frank Miller story of Batman, where he doesn't kill.
Right.
I mean, as gray as he is in that story, he doesn't kill. Mm-hmm. There's lots of this interior monologue where he's going through and he's describing how much he's hurting the criminals,
right?
But he never kills them. And even spoiler, towards the end when the Joker dies, the Joker basically commits suicide. Right? He paralyzes him, and then the Joker snaps his own neck so that Batman will get blamed for this crime. Now that is a fascinating piece in and of itself, because Batman is in this gray space and he is set against Superman. And that is where, the Batman versus Superman movie was so interesting, because we had these moral systems that were in conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. And if you look at each character, Batman versus Superman, neither one of them is uniformly wrong. They're just different. Yeah. Where Batman really doesn't have a whole lot of faith in people. Mm-hmm. He feels like he needs to impose order. Superman, on the other hand, does have faith in people, but then he allows them to have a certain amount of freedom, and they often betray that freedom. Mm-hmm. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both their systems, and in the Batman versus Superman movie, he is a killer. Yes, I don't think there's any way. When you're blowing up cars that people are driving in, there's no way for them to make it out of there. But also the thing that I think is interesting, again, people are unwilling to sort of people will follow the comics because there's always another comic coming out next month. Yeah. But when you have to wait 3 years, people are always arguing about how that's not my Batman. Yeah. And if you see the Snyder cut of Justice League, it is a redemption arc for him, right? It seems like for Zack Snyder, he was pushed in this direction because Robin was killed, and that made him lose his faith in community until it came back, right? He had a reason to be responsible for the world around him again.
Where does Lucius Fox come in? I know you mentioned Commissioner Gordon and Alfred, so why was the Lucius Fox character created?
Lucius Fox, he first made his appearance in the comics in the 1970s. And I think the Lucius Fox character was sort of a go-between, because we always had Alfred, who was part of his home life, right? It was associated with his parents, mm-hmm. but Lucius Fox then became associated with Wayne Enterprises. Okay. So we had these mentors that existed in both places at that point. And I think also we sort of saw this transition to Bruce Wayne as not just the millionaire playboy, but as a member of industry, right? Yeah. This genuine part of the world who could shape things differently. And if I can go back to the Nolan movies again, one of the things that I think is interesting about the Nolan movies is that we do sort of preserve the basic tenets of the superhero journey, mm-hmm. because we have a villain for them to fight. But it really seems like also one of the ideas in the final Nolan movie, mm-hmm. The Dark Knight Rises, is that maybe Batman, as a billionaire, was misspending.
Yeah.
He was putting all of this stuff into R&D so they could beat the heck out of criminals, and maybe he should have been putting some of that money into orphanages.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that is funny. So, what are your thoughts on, again, the movie that I sought to explore here and all the research I've done for the last few years and people I've interviewed? Do you think that someone like a Batman could exist? I mean, I know that there are people that are special forces, that are CIA operatives, that, but it's a fun conversation to have. And it's a conversation everybody has around the water cooler. You're coming at it more from the historical literary sense. But you've watched a million movies. I'm sure you have thoughts. Could a guy like this exist, and under what conditions could it exist?
Sure.
Or could he exist, or she?
I mean, my initial answer was very much influenced by the basic framework of storytelling, saying that it's always embedded in culture. I think that's true for real life too. He would need to have that network to support him, or she would have to have that network to support her. But by the same token, there are these things that we have to recognize when we're looking at the story of Batman, that would make it incredibly difficult to be that guy. Because Batman is incredibly lucky. One of his talents is the ability not to die. It's just like all of this extreme way in which Batman is put into really, really awful physical situations.
Right.
It seems like a human being couldn't recover from that. Now, as far as what can we do, you started off in an interesting place, because you started off with the Keaton movie, and then of course the one that would succeed that series would be the Nolan movies. And as we moved from one to the other, we did really move into that militaristic development,
more tactical, grounded
of Batman. Right. And if you look at a different Snyder, this Scott Snyder comic book series of Batman, I mean, that takes it even further in that it really does develop the idea of technology, and so he has a mechanical suit. That is one of the things that drives him. I think that, things like incredible detective skills and incredible athletic training, being a master of the martial arts, all of that is great. But I think that one more reference to Zack Snyder's Justice League. I think that the movie hit it on the head with its best joke, but also maybe its greatest truism. What's your superpower? I'm rich.
Yeah.
I think that a hero, to be truly successful, would have to have that type of military grade equipment and technology to support what he's doing. You would have to have a command center to be able to do this type of thing. So, we've actually moved in that direction too, with Alfred being in charge of this command center. Or, in the comic book, sometimes it's the former Batgirl who's been paralyzed, who is in charge of all that information gathering and mobilizing the Bat family out in the field. I think all of that stuff would be absolutely necessary to make this work. Could it work? I don't know. It's just, it's such an idealistic notion to see that we have one or two or three heroes out there to change the world. We see it outside of superhero context too, right? It's what we see over and over again in the Mission Impossible movies. But can that small force really work? I don't know. It's getting tougher and tougher to answer that question in our contemporary age, when so much of what is done at a military level is done remotely through drones and technology.
Yeah. I think it's always a fun water cooler discussion. I mean, every time I bring it up to someone, they're like, yeah, okay, well, maybe, So, I mean, even in talking to all the people that I've talked to over the last, 3 years, I always pose that question. What do you think? Like, could it happen? And the general consensus, even from military special forces guys, is like, well, if you had a team and they were really talented, and he was a very special guy or girl and had incredible, I mean, just the training alone, let's be real. I broke this down in the movie, you'll see, where I started asking people, how long would this take to be good at street tactics? How long would it be good to be good at Muay Thai? And I started adding the numbers. And it's a pretty staggering, like it starts out at the base minimum if you did nothing else but this, with all the numbers people told me, at 5.5 years. So you're not even, and that's with a good starting point. Like you're a moderately good athlete. You're young enough. You're smart. You know, you're situationally aware. There's things that you just, you know, some people just inherently can draw well, and some people just, no matter how hard they try, just can't draw. So it's like you'd have to have the inherent set of almost genetics to go with it. You couldn't be 125 pounds and a distance runner. I mean, you would need to be built like a linebacker. And so there's so many factors. It's a really fun, but the scenario, it's like, it would have to be the perfect concoction of a person. But everyone was like, yeah, I mean, maybe, but for how long? Like maybe for a year, and then you're caught. And it would have to be, I think we talked about this, very specific. Like you're not on a building waiting around sipping a cup of coffee like, oh, there's a bank robbery. Like that's not going to happen. One of the guys I talked to, one of the SEALs I talked to, was like, the enemy's always ahead of the curve. They know when they're going to commit a crime. The hero is trying to like react because they can't be proactive. Maybe they can using social media and things, but they don't know when this stuff's going to happen. So just that, you know, in the comics, you don't even think about it, but Batman swoops down and stops the random mugging. He swoops down and stops the random drug exchange for money. That would take months of intel and to do that one thing. So yeah, I think if it is ever done, and look, I've talked to some pretty cool, tough dudes, and they're like, there's stuff going on in the world that people don't know about. And it takes people like this that have these skill sets, but they're generally part of a team. They're generally part of, you know, a SEAL team is multiple members plus intel, plus a drone in the sky, plus, you know, all these things. You would have to have all that stuff.
But and you know, as I think about it too, you know, the idea that maybe you'll be able to keep this up for about 1 year. There's this famous painting by Alex Cross, who everyone likes. Everyone loves Alex Ross. He does these sort of Norman Rockwell style paintings of superheroes. And there's this image of Batman, and you see him from the back. He's this muscle-bound figure, and he has scars all over his body. It's excellent. But you know what I was thinking when I saw that is, I think that Alex Ross was trying to represent a lifetime of crime fighting. But in all honesty, that would be 6 months based upon Batman's normal schedule.
Well, yeah, and I talked to a couple just CrossFit athletes because I figured that would be the best in looking around. Like, yeah, there's people who sprint and do weightlifting, but from what I know of CrossFit, it's the full combo of power, speed, and strength and endurance. Seems like it would make sense. I even saw an article somewhere Batman would do CrossFit, and they're incredibly strong. Most CrossFit bodies are extremely muscled, but they also have speed. So it made sense. But the thing that came up often was injury. Like I said, okay, when you're even just like, think about all the stuff that he'd have to do, right? And this is where it gets kind of fun because you're breaking it down into the little details. You know, I went and played softball this summer and I got hurt like 4 times. Like it just, and granted I'm older now, but it's just so easy to tweak a hamstring, even if you're young, and to tear a muscle or, and think about what that would do to your vigilante career if you blew your ACL, or you may never be the same. And that stuff doesn't happen in the comics. Like he'll get a black eye and a bloody lip and then a broken rib, and then he's back 2 days later, you know, gutting the pain. Look, Navy SEALs can handle a lot of pain. They're mentally conditioned to handle a tremendous amount of pain. Some world-class athletes can handle tons of pain. But the reality is, you sprain your ankle, you're done for 2 months. And then your career is quickly going to end because Batman goes out the next night. But realistically, you wouldn't. You would be so banged up.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say too, you know, the question, you know, does this sort of mythic representation propel us to be better? Well, you know, if someone were to actually live this life, my question is whether they could stay better.
Yeah,
you know, they might be propelled by a moral vision at the very beginning, but a Navy SEAL is part of a system.
Exactly.
Right. And that system makes sure that the Navy SEAL follows the prescribed framework that is established for them. But, you know, if you were truly on your own, like Batman so often is depicted as being, I don't know if you were getting beaten up on a regular basis, whether you would be the same person. Yeah. You know, I think about the arc of someone like Rorschach in The Watchmen, who started off very much as a Batman character, but then became the guy who was obsessive and didn't bathe and did horrible things to criminals because he was convinced that, you know, most of the world was not worth saving.
Yeah. Well, let's end with this. I think the fun conversation. so when we look at comic book heroes, because I actually did talk to a social worker and a psychiatrist, a counselor she works with a lot of first responders, former military, police, fire, and she uses superhero stories in her therapy. And it's been very successful because there's parallels, right? In these heroes that we call them, they hate to be called heroes, but these people who go out and do military service and they get wounded or they have PTSD and they, have to, they're dealing with that. But then she's using kind of this therapeutic method of like, hey, let's watch part of this movie and see how and so she's using it in therapy. We look at these heroes as like ideals, right? Like they're the top of this, the best at that, the greatest at this. They have a moral compass. What can we learn through the literature, even through some of the films, aspiring to, a Batman type character? Like, what can we as just the average run of the mill teachers, human beings, what can we get out of this to become better people?
Well, the idea that this therapy is being used with first responders who don't want to be called heroes, I think that that's an important place to start, because for the most part, the superheroes that are really resonant with people are the characters that do not aspire to be heroes. Right. It's just, a radioactive spider bit me. I've got these powers. What am I going to do? Well, I mean, actually, Spider-Man's first response was, well, I'm going to make money. But then his Uncle Ben gets killed and he's like, oh, yeah, but I've got to do something else. Right. He didn't aspire to be a hero. It's just now I've got to do the right thing with the skills that I have. So I think that that's an important place to start, because I think that's what the first responders are doing, right? Is that I've developed these skills. It's just what I do. But if there is a catastrophic situation, I will run into it. That type of thing. I think anyone who starts off by saying, I want to be a hero is the kind of person who grows up to be a tyrant, right?
That's a good statement. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I think even from a empathetic, I know we talked about a little when I interviewed you before about PTSD too, of just, getting up in the morning with severe trauma and just doing life and being a father and being a husband and being present. That in itself is something we can aspire to, which is what some of these heroes do in the comic books. They deal with grief and then they overcome it to a degree and use it. And so I did early on in this process too. I was going to approach it a little differently. And I did talk to about 7 people who had gone through pretty significant trauma, and then how I wanted to know, they never get over it. Right. But they kind of used it to form an organization or work with children, or it changed a path for them because they had gone through some of this trauma. And so I think that is what we can pull from the trauma side of it, but also just in terms of like, you look at a character like a Batman, who's the ideal, right? He's the specimen. He's not eating Big Macs. He's living. I think there's a lot we can pull from a character like that just to aspire to it, not to go beat people up and put on a mask. Although there are people who put on masks and walk around their cities, but in terms of just some of the qualities of like, I do really like this about this character. I wish I was more heroic. I wish I was more helpful. Even just, I think you said in the interview, to help the person next to you, just do one good thing today, help one person out. We're both teachers. We teach, we talk to kids, we work with younger people. And so, how we can aspire higher. And maybe, as my youth pastor once said, you strive for excellence, but if you get to good, that's okay. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the idea of the superhero, it works as a metaphor, and it's an incredibly flexible metaphor. We've seen it applied in lots of different. I mean, we watch a movie like The Incredibles, and it's really a metaphor that describes what this guy is going through in middle age. I love it.
That's one of my favorites.
That sort of thing. But I love it when the story is expanded.
Yeah.
I'm going to use an example where it's expanded then retracted to begin with. Spider-Man, he settled down with MJ, but people wanted young teenage Spider-Man. So there was this incredibly convoluted story where he had to basically sell his future and return to who he was, because that's what the fans wanted. That's where we're romanticizing his early suffering, and not looking at this larger framework that we have. I love the alternate histories of Spider-Man where he's a father, right? Yeah. And he has a young daughter. I love the stories that we now see. We've seen it for a long time with the Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four is about family dynamics. Right. Okay, so that's part of it. And it's about how we expand that. The most recent arc that I've been reading has been about how we not only work within this unit of 4 people, but we create a found family. You know how we do that, and one of my favorite, because it's the most long-standing, is Superman. Right? He's had this established relationship with Lois Lane. He now has a son who, in a certain timeline, has become the next Superman, and this is the busiest guy in the universe, right? And yet he still finds time because he realizes this is the type of thing that ultimately will establish a legacy. Right. So the superhero story often allows us to look at things in a broader context. Not always, because I do think we romanticize the suffering, and sometimes we spend too much time with Wolverine being angry, but then we get a movie like Logan.
Oh, great movie. Yep. I agree. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I think we covered a lot there, a lot to digest. Could probably keep going forever when talking about comics with you. I think we could probably go forever. But and you're a wise, smart man when it comes to this topic, which is why I keep coming back to you. And you also just did give me a job as an adjunct professor one time, so I have to, I think, were you the department chair? I think you were the department chair at that time.
I was. So
you hooked me up. We had a little brief run over at Judson University. And then that was it. And then I was told I don't have the credentials. So goodbye.
It wasn't me that
I know
said
it wasn't.
that.
And it's fine. And I totally understood. I totally got it. And we're like, oh, we'll let you go for a little while and then we'll bring you back maybe in a year. But anyway, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon, hopefully. All right.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye.